Here we go.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Popular Music Books in Process series. I'm Francesca Royster, and our co-organizers are Kimberly Mack, Gus Stadler, Eric Weisberg, and Carl Wilson. And this is a joint venture of IASPM US and the Journal of Popular Music Studies. If you hop onto Eric Weisberg's YouTube channel, you can watch our last session, which was an amazing conversation between Kimberly Mack and Lena Dawes about Kim's new book from the 33.5 series, Living Colors Time's Up. And you can also catch up on the other sessions. Our next session, which will be our last session of the 2022-2023 school year, is going to be Imani Kia Johnson's Dark Matter in Breaking Ciphers, The Life of Africanist Aesthetics in Hip Hop from Oxford University Press. And this is going to be a joint presentation between Imani and Mary Fogarty, who are co-editors and authors of the Oxford Handbook of Hip Hop Dance Studies. We also want to kind of let you know that we are planning to put a new call out for presenters pretty soon. And we're also looking for a volunteer to be on board as a co-organizer for the Popular Music Books in Process series. If you have an interest in inkling, please email Eric as soon as it pops into your brain. But today we are so excited to hear a presentation from Janet Borgerson and Jonathan Schroeder on Design for Success, Better Living, and Self-Improvement with Mid-Century Instructional Records. So this is actually a combination of three wonderful books on design and album covers. Design for Living for Hi-Fi, Design for Hi-Fi Living, the Vinyl LP in Mid-Century America from 2017, and Design for Dancing, How Mid-Century Records Taught America to Dance from MIT in 2021 came first. They're going to briefly introduce those and then turn to their forthcoming book from their Mid-Century Records trilogy, Design for Success, Better Living, and Self-Improvement with Mid-Century Instructional Records. This series of books unveils vinyl records designed implicitly and explicitly to teach and guide mid-century Americans. Inspired by their interest in mid-century design, visual culture, and recording industry history, as well as an inexhaustible enthusiasm for their captivating record collection, they will discuss mid-century record albums' integral role in the modernist project. So a little bit about them. There's more, of course, to come. Janet Borgerson studied philosophy, economics, and writing at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and earned a PhD in philosophy from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, completing postdoctoral work in philosophy and religious studies at Brown University. Her research often engages intersections of philosophy, business, and culture, particularly around issues of identity. She's currently a senior Wicklander Fellow at the Institute for Business and Professional Ethics at DePaul University. Woohoo! And she is co-author of Design for Dancing, How Mid-Century Records Taught America to Dance, and Design for Hi-Fi Living, the Vinyl LP in Mid-Century America. Jonathan Schroeder is the William A. Kern Professor in the School of Communication, the Rochester Institute of Technology in New York. His research largely focuses upon the intersections of branding, mid-century media and music, and visual culture. He received his PhD from the University of California, Berkeley, and he did postdoctoral study at the Rhode Island School of Design. His works include Design for Living, Design for Hi-Fi Living, Design for Dancing, and Design for Dancing, How Mid-Century Records Taught America to Dance. And now I'm going to turn things over to Janet and Jonathan.
Thank you. Thanks for that introduction.
Oh, actually, should we also tell the audience to please put questions as they occur to you in the chat? And then as at the end of the talk, I will call on you, ask you to unmute, and then you can ask your question. We also suggest to the presenters not to watch the chat while it's going on. You may have already heard this because it gets distracting. And also, if you want to just make ordinary comments and remarks, or please feel free to use the chat to chat.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we're going to start with the conclusion for the forthcoming book, Design for Success.
So we're doing things a little bit backwards, maybe this way, listening backwards. We'll hear some interesting messages or something.
From Paul. All right. Conclusion, mid-century records and the creation of modern America. We had a hunch. Mid-century vinyl record albums were neglected, especially the ones we loved and collected. The record albums are unexpectedly spectacular elements of mid-century media, we mused, and they reveal fascinating aspects of the era's cultural history. No one else has taken these records seriously, we thought. We should write a book. As we conclude the third volume of our Design for trilogy, we recognize that our insight proved more profound than we initially anticipated. Yes, as a vital component of U.S. material culture, mid-century records did serve as an information distribution format for shaping modern visions. They also played an essential role in building participatory democracy in post-war America, aligning the populace with strategic post-war projects. Yet beyond this, mid-century records mobilized the most basic individual human processes and practices for molding mind and body and transforming self and country. By explicating and laying out for examination mid-century vinyl records and their covers, we witness their influence on domestic spaces, social relationships, aspirational self-development, educational technology, and career training. Record albums embraced not only practices of consumption, but pedagogical ideologies, teaching a citizenry the basics of learning how to learn, consuming ideas, consuming identities, consuming knowledge. These all are crucial in a participatory democracy. The willingness and ability to take in, process, and mobilize information, indeed the willingness to be instructed, form the most basic aspects of a consumer culture populace. In this sense, education is a consumption practice, most obviously the consumption of information and perhaps knowledge. There is no post-war consumer culture or enlightenment, for that matter, without developing and evolving philosophies and techniques of education, instruction, and training. There is no marketing, branding, or advertising for the future of post-war modern America without this. Teaching and learning for the sake of building a participatory democracy in a consumer culture requires philosophies, strategies, lessons, and perhaps visual schematics, dance footsteps, exercise routine, atomic particles that, it turns out, fit, folded and flat, inside mid-century record albums. Design for Success LPs encouraged better living at work, home, and leisure. They provided recorded advice on topics as varied as raising a family, playing bongos, cooking Italian, and expanding mind power. Instructional records recruited private domestic space for training and skill development. They also depended on a personal motivation for self-improvement. These often prosaic instructional records promoted progress and reinforced the U.S.'s deeply rooted do-it-yourself aesthetic. In this way, they offered an unexpected yet enlightening lens for understanding mid-century contributions to the American prospect. For example, the U.S. Army's How to Succeed record, with its charmingly earnest set of radio spots, promises, with Army, a future you can choose.
Veterans occasionally refer to the recruiting slogan that was popular when they signed up, as in, we're be all you can be soldiers, or he's Army strong. All through high school, I remember watching a U.S. Armed Forces recruitment television ad. Army,
Navy,
Air Force,
Marines.
We don't ask for experience, we give it. You won't read it in a book, you'll live it. In the late 1960s, the Army's recruiting efforts focused on success. How to Succeed, Messages from the U.S. Army, includes messages meant for radio play that provide glimpses into how the military continued to recruit amidst growing unrest about the Vietnam War. One of a series of How to Succeed recordings, it's presented as a public service by the United States Army. The record includes 24 tracks ranging in 20 to 60 seconds. The label's fine print states, this record is a property of the government of the United States and must be used as public service material only. And in bold capital letters, do not use after 1969. The Saturday morning cartoonish cover shows an adventurous group of recruits, including paratrooper, helicopter pilot, and scuba diver, as well as more mundane figures of nurse, radio operator, and air traffic signaler. We don't have any immediate plans to embark on a late military career, but we decided nevertheless to subject ourselves to the Army's recruiting messages. First up, a 60-second spot, High School. This musical number includes rock instruments with singers that sound a bit like the Beach Boys meets the Mamas and the Papas. The song urges impressionable listeners, with Army, a future you can choose. With Army, the future's up to you. Spoken parts inform that you can learn to tell a computer what to say and move a mountain that's in the way. A more mature sounding narrative closes with a stern command: your future, your decision, choose Army. Few spots feature short dramatic scenarios enhanced with military sound effects, like pulsing helicopters and firing rifles. Other spots include Professional Nurse, Sounds of Leadership, and While You're Young. On one called Communication, we're introduced to Jane Andrews, a captain in the Women's Army Corps. She's stationed in Munich, and on weekends she sees the sights, the timeless heart of old Bavaria, Paris, Amsterdam, Venice. Jane didn't want an everyday type job. She wanted responsibilities. She wanted challenges. The spot ends, a chance to put your talents to work while you see the world. No mention of Southeast Asia.
The predilection for self-improvement, whether honing innate abilities, deepening comprehension, or keeping one's body toned and strong, is surely not uniquely U.S. phenomenon. Yet instructional and self-improvement records from the U.S. do reveal a distinctly national narrative. For example, albums from Amway Corporation specifically name and honor the American way, a biblical claim to capitalist free enterprise, entrepreneurial invention, and deep anti-communist instincts. And here is Richard DeVos. You'll know Betsy DeVos, co-founder of Amway. And on the back, besides just the idea of selling the American way, you see Canada there with the American flag. There's a box that says to enjoy the same privileges, quote unquote, as the Russians, Americans would have to. And then there's a list of things that Americans have many, many more of than Russians. So that's an interesting Amway record. Many other records build upon ostensibly long-term American values and traditions involving individual ingenuity and initiative in the face of vast territory, opportunity, and choice in ways that echo notions of manifest destiny. Motivational inducements to claim more and reach farther suggest possibilities of endless growth, progress, and wealth for individuals bold enough to continue moving forward, onward, and up. Mid-century instructional records promised gratifying achievements, fulfilled fantasies, and satisfied desires, and offered inroads to previously unknown destinies. Certainly, the implications of such visions for the realities of competition, cooperation, and negotiation reverberate more broadly on the global stage. At mid-century, the Cold War suffused contemporary living in the U.S. Indeed, the American home formed an important site for embodying visions of a good life during a period dominated by dueling superpowers and U.S. concerns to contain Soviet communism. The capitalist realism that infuses so much Design for Success album art reconfigured national goals and domestic soft power communications. On these covers, monochrome images free of fantasy capture ordinary mid-century Americans experiencing progress, equality of opportunity, and conquering new challenges in everyday settings. We see that capitalist realism helped to conjure traditional let's get down to business values, at the same time pushing agendas for a more modern, market-driven America. The U.S. recruited cultural weapons of modern design, abstract art, and jazz in its claims for modern consumer sovereignty and freedom of expression. Abstract art, with its emphasis on creativity and subjectivity, was held up as an example of American freedom. Jazz, with its integral mode of individual improvisation, was extolled as a key U.S. contribution to world culture. For example, the U.S. Information Agency exhibited American art, including Jackson Pollock's abstract canvases, at the American National Exhibition held in Moscow in 1959. The free expression seen in modern abstract art served as a riposte against state-sanctioned Soviet realism as commandeered for political propaganda. Billed as a trade fair, the Moscow exhibition became a battleground for a riveting cultural clash in the era's Cold War skirmishes. U.S. manufacturers were invited to ship over their best and brightest products in a concerted effort to show the Soviets and the world the superiority of the American free enterprise system. Soviet visitors marveled at gleaming kitchen appliances, the backdrop for the famous kitchen debate between Khrushchev and Nixon, streamlined automobiles, and the latest American fashion, as well as shelves of books. Also on display in Moscow, a selection of mid-century vinyl records, favoring classical and jazz, their 12-inch by 12-inch covers celebrating a world beyond the Iron Curtain. Thus, basic components of U.S. consumer culture, such as appliances, art, books, fashion, furniture, and vinyl records, contributed to Cold War cultural diplomacy and pinpoint how the rise of post-war consumer culture intersected with global politics and ideology. Most of the LPs presented in our books involve instruction and improvement for U.S. environments of work, home, and leisure. In these contexts, individuals focus on and alter themselves. In so doing, listeners potentially improve their social as well as economic community within what has been called, quote, the therapeutic discourse. However, by suggesting that the viewpoints, priorities, advice, and admonitions heard on mid-century records addressed and suited everyone, including unknown others in different circumstances and from varied cultural backgrounds, whether within the U.S. or abroad, the albums paint a homogenizing, if imperialist picture. We love our records, but they are not without limitations. On our first volume in the trilogy, Designed for Hi-Fi Living, the Vinyl LP in Mid-Century America, provided a broad framework for thinking about mid-century vinyl albums. We showed how album covers could be productively considered media objects that have communicative functions beyond identifying musical acts, recording genre, or album content. Indeed, mid-century album covers taught lessons about modern values. We argued that record album covers from the 1950s and 1960s offered post-war America modernist visions and alluring lessons for achieving cosmopolitan and contemporary lifestyles fueled by a consumer culture of options, choice, and consumer sovereignty, always in contrast to Soviet models. The ideal home, the ideal living room, the ideal romance, honeymoon, and family, not to mention the national Cold War victories in the kitchen and in outer space, all were visible, tangible, achievable in the fantastical frame of the LP cover. Our second record-related volume, Designed for Dancing, How Mid-Century Records Taught America to Dance, revealed that fun, colorful, and sometimes provocative cha-cha-cha, tango, limbo, and twist records reflected similar concerns. Dances from waltz to watusi, square dance to swim, polka to hula, filled with vibrant, sensual, and seductive poses and personas, demonstrated broader cultural themes, often in surprising ways. Dance records tell tales of American identity. In conjunction with Design for Hi-Fi Living and Design for Dancing, Design for Success explores the contribution of consumer artifacts to the imagination and construction of modern U.S. identity and global citizenship at mid-century. We examine the ways in which instructional records, whether for salesmanship, speed reading, or sports, express core values of U.S. culture, including self-reliance, opportunity, and upward mobility, embody the self-help movement's focus on self-improvement, and illuminate the fundamental American notion of self-motivated success.
So we started writing about records, I guess, in the 90s, and we started collecting. We'd both been collecting, but when we got together, we had a predilection for Hawaiian records, and we have a huge Hawaiian record collection. And that was really some of our first articles.
Hawaiian.
Oh, yeah, Hawaiian popular music. But we began to look at the ethics of representation. We began to look at these records in a colonial and also a kind of a touristic lens of understanding how Hawaiian records were formed part of a huge touristic and national project to bring Hawaii in as the 50th state and to integrate Hawaii and the Hawaiian paradisal identity into the mainland United States.
So these Hawaiian albums, we really started to look at them in relation to their gender representations, their race representations, and also the colonialist vision they were continuing even as the U.S. brought Hawaii in. And that formed a chapter on Hawaii within Design for Hi-Fi Living, the first book. And as we were thinking about dances for the second book, because we thought, what's the second book going to be on? We've got all these records. What is it going to be? We're thought, wow, look at all the dance records. We have amazing dance records.
Yeah, we wanted to write a book, and we didn't see one. We wanted to write a book on dance records, kind of from the 1950 to 1970. So we didn't do disco. Disco's another story. There's a couple good books on disco, but we were focused on this mid-century time period.
We had so many that we wrote about more than we should have, and we had to cut those at the last minute to reduce the length of our book. Our editor said, yeah, wonderful, but people don't really need to read about that many.
We wanted it to be comprehensive.
To be complete.
So we included chapters about twist, mambo, merengue, but we also included theme chapters. So chapters like time for dancing. So Paris Prado, Havana 3 a.m.
The drum, we thought what could be more basic to rhythm and dividing space into individual notes and creating the rhythm than the drum. So drum chapter is there. But one of the things we were thinking of because of the Hawaii chapter and because of the hula is that the hula would be one of the dance we would feature, and that belly dancing would be one of the dances that we would feature. And then we looked at each other and thought, oh, wow, these records are really cheesecake. A lot of them are really on a border of what might be acceptable in terms of gender, race, ethnicity, representation. So we decided we needed to do something to open up these objects, even though they had some of these problems, and include them, but make sure that we included them in a way that they didn't just appear as entertaining cheesecake, but rather they were going to do the kind of work that we wanted our composite media to do.
In writing these books, we've tried to balance between celebration. I mean, we like the records, and critique. And I think it's one thing to understand we're writing about these 50s and 60s representation from the 21st century, but we're also not merely saying, oh, these were sexist. We're trying to kind of balance that. And so I'll read a section from the introduction to Design for Dancing that tries to get at that issue. So this is Dance Records as Cultural, Ideological, and Material Artifacts. In this book, the Design for Dancing book, we challenge dismissive assumptions that have led to the general exclusion of dance albums from various canons, popular music milestones, album cover design, and culturally significant mid-century media. Dance albums, with few exceptions, don't appear on lists of top records of all time, which favor jazz, pop, and rock. Popular music scholars often neglect dance and dance crazes, emphasizing musical innovation within narrow canyons or focusing on heroic performers. Present company excluded. As one music writer wryly observed, quote, the real failure of most researchers is their lack of interest in dancing. This lack of interest trickles down to dance record covers.
And we have to say, just parenthetically, when we wrote this Design for Dancing book, we didn't think that there would be so many, especially white guys in their late 60s, early 70s, who would run into, who otherwise are amazingly supportive and interesting, but hate to dance.
Several podcasts that we've done, which have been rewarding, but our host kind of said, oh, I don't like to dance. Oh, I'm not a dancer. So it's like, well, okay, this is a whole book about dance records. So anyway, that was an interesting.
That was an interesting little,
All right. So blues, jazz, and rock dominate lists of great album covers. Most books on classic album covers present dance albums largely for their cheesecake qualities. Dance albums with their bright, colorful graphics, fun appearance, and female models often slip under the radar of critical consideration of album cover design. For example, in a substantial discussion about album covers, a recent book on mid-century graphic design complains about the era's, quote, growing ascendancy of photography over graphics or illustration, especially the use of racy imagery with sex appeal, with little or no link to the music itself. The abundance of record sleeves showing photographs of models in lingerie or bikinis represents a real low point in the history of graphic design, unquote. This line of criticism reflects conventional biases in design ideology that interfere with careful consideration of several genres of mid-century albums, including dance records. First, a bias for graphics or illustration over photography pervades much modernist design discourse. reflecting long-standing reservations about photography's aesthetic status. Moreover, the fine art canon largely excluded color photography until recently. Color was linked with commercial arenas such as advertising, fashion, and technicolor entertainment. Black and white photography remained associated with artistic expression, photojournalism, and documentary, grounding the status of black and white's authenticity, or presumed authenticity, over color's fantasy and play. Clearly, most mid-century dance records came down on the side of color and demonstrate a shift from illustrated design to photography during the 1960s album cover art. Second, a bias against models in lingerie limits what counts as worthy design elements. Granted, mid-century record covers are often retrograde or sexist, but underestimating female performance of aesthetic labor means missing the work of posing and embodying glamorous appearance. Further, in some cases, women photographed on mid-century dance covers are not simply models. For example, the well-known Turkish performer Neglia Atiz appears in full belly dance regalia on dabke, exotic erotic dances of the Middle East. The Latin album Rockin' Cha features Margot Rodriguez, a celebrated Palladium ballroom dancer, mambo dancer. These female figures do indeed have a link to the music. They too have stories to tell. The glamour of models on many mid-century dance albums distracts from the pragmatic task at hand, not only to animate and demonstrate dance, but also to persuade you to buy that record. Dissuaded by preconceptions, researchers have tended to underestimate the aesthetic, communicative, and political dimensions of many mid-century records. By attending only to the dress and physical allure on the covers, design critics miss significant aspects of these images' communicative power. Averting the gaze from the obvious often leads to unexpected insights. In other words, one must look beyond the lingerie. In short, by unreflectively or even reflectively favoring certain forms of graphic design or black and white photography, diminishing the importance of color photography, and underestimating female aesthetic labor, critics of dance records systematically disregard their contribution to a history of visual culture and dance and their role in mid-century media.
So then we thought, what's the next book? And a number of the records that we had talked about in the first two books were implicitly instructional. Even some of the dance records weren't explicitly instructional, but maybe they had a dance graphic. Here's how you do footsteps for the tango. In the first book, there were lessons on how to cook ham mousse, how to decorate your back patio,
How to have a perfect dinner party.
Yeah, so there were some explicit instruction, but a lot of it was implicit. A lot of it was learned from the photograph, learned from the aesthetic impressions that you're getting from looking at the photograph on the cover. But then we realized that we have some records that are explicitly instructional. They're talking about here how to learn Italian, here how to learn Russian, improve your conversation in Arabic, how to be a better bowler, how to play bridge, how to play drums. And we thought, okay, this is interesting, explicitly instructional. And I think our editor said, well, how are these different? You're saying they're all pedagogical objects. They're all pedagogical. And we said, yeah, but there's something really interesting about the ones that are trying to teach mid-century, post-war, Cold War Americans, what it would mean in this new era to bring the nation forward in a kind of national political vision.
And we ended up writing quite a bit on records as instructional technology, going back to Edison and his belief that this would be a big part of records. And I think in a way, we're kind of writing a parallel history where these instructional records, or spoken word records too, got sidetracked, obviously, to music. But instructional records are kind of part of mid-century culture, and they're, again, neglected, and something that we thought would be worth writing about.
One of the issues that came up, our battery's going down, Jonathan's running to get a cord so we don't lose you all. One of the things that's interesting and that we had to deal with in our book proposal and in talking with our editor was that some of the record covers in this implicitly instructional genre were not exactly exciting. They were black and white. They were faded. They had businessmen in suits and ties. And so we had to think of how to talk about the allure of the pages in our book when they weren't going to be particularly colorful, when they weren't going to be showing visions that people felt were fantastical. And we came to rely a little bit on an analysis via capitalist realism to try to make the argument that, again, just like with those dance records that had been underestimated and had gone under the radar because people dismissed them, our record covers in the Design for Success book, although many of them are wonderful, still could have been put under the radar in the sense that people would say, well, they're not very fun to look at. You know, there's more black and white, there's more businessmen who care about them. So we really did feel like part of that visual argument had to be made, that even though they might look mundane and maybe people won't be quite as excited by what's on the cover, they needed to be looked at. These objects needed to be opened up. So now we're going to do a little show and tell, if that's okay. Are we doing?
This is one of our favorites. It's called Folk Song Kit, one of Elektra Records' early releases. Nice box set. Got an Elektra chord chart to learn how to play folk guitar. It's got a beautiful booklet.
One of the things about the booklet, besides, you know, just giving you the basic chord chart, is there's the picture of Washington Square. It turns out that was the epicenter of this folk, or maybe pseudo folk movement, I would venture to say. And within this booklet is an essay by Lee Hayes from the Weavers. Then you have lyrics with little chord changes up above, so you know when it's time to move your fingers on the chords that you've just learned from the chord chart. But our favorite thing, I think, here is at the back, besides the recommended books that you could read to become more educated about folk music more generally, is almost like a little tourist section. It's the where to go.
Where to go for the hip happening spots.
So this record was put out in 1959. And so in New York, you might venture to the Folklore Center at 110 McDougal Street. There's the proprietor, Israel Young. There is the Washington Square, of course, where everyone turns up, quote unquote, sooner or later. The Village Gate, Thompson and Bleecker Streets, the Duane Hotel. But then we've got a few places in San Francisco, the Hungry Eye. In Chicago, there's the Old Town School of Folk Music. Aspen, Colorado, the Limelight. Philadelphia, gathering places come and go there, apparently. Boston, WXHR. Los Angeles, Theater Bickle's 2 clubs. And a guitar store on Sunset Boulevard. So we just love the fact that they incorporated a little bit of a tourist brochure into the folk song kit. And I'll just read you our description of that album. It does a decent job of showing you kind of how we spend time with each of these pieces of composite, the object. So folk song kit. Bright blue, warm red, orange, and yellow enliven the dark wood on the cover of folk song kit. An acoustic guitar casts a sharp shadow within a rustic multi-shelf display case shared with a well-played banjo and a black vinyl record. The kit was created by Zach Holtzman, founder and producer of Elektra Records. The spare evocative cover was shot by photographer and filmmaker George Picco, husband of folk singer Gene Ritchie, who photographed a range of album covers, including folk classic like Ritchie's A Time for Singing in 1965 and Josh White's Chain Gang Songs, 58, as well as The Fastest Balalaika in the West from 1962, Music to Watch Girls By in 67, and Hits for Truck Driving Man, 1976. So one of the things we like to do when we're describing is learn a little bit about the designers, the photographers, the producers, and we try to go into that a little bit, even beyond just the musicians or performers. Released to capitalize on the 1950s folk flowering, Elektra's folk song kit, quote, is designed to give the beginner a grasp of the fundamentals of folk guitar playing, end quote. All that is missing, according to us, is a scruffy beard, a peasant skirt, and a certain practiced righteousness. Open the folk song kits box to find an LP, instruction booklet, recommendations for folk records and folk music clubs and shops, basic musical settings for several folk standards such as Red River Valley, and a guitar chord chart. The thoughtful booklet cover features a photograph of New York's Washington Square Park, where folk enthusiasts gather, and includes lyrics and chords for each song, a brief informational note, as well as an introductory essay, The Folk Song Bridge, by Lee Hayes of the Weavers. Side 1 consists of guitar lessons. Quote, if you are adept and have musical training of some sort, you might master this course in a week, unquote. From virtuoso guitarist and banjo player Billy Fayer, publisher of the folk music magazine Caravan. Side 2 includes 20 folk songs, quote, arranged in the probable order of difficulty, taking into consideration the chords used and the strums, quote, sung by Milt Oken, an influential arranger, producer, and conductor who went on to work with Peter, Paul and Mary, Miriam Makeba, and John Denver. You know, clearly, because these objects are our focus, we are looking at the liner notes. We're using the liner notes. We're trying to show how the liner notes are pushing forward the argument for the various records. Folk Song Kit received Billboard's top score of 4 stars, very strong sales potential, essential inventory. Their upbeat review concluded, quote, imaginative production, which should find a good market, particularly as a gift item, unquote. Despite folk music's anti-commercial rhetoric, the music industry, including instrument makers, sheet music publishers, and record companies, helped create a thriving market for folk music materials. A look at folk music magazine and records like Folk Song Kit show that, according to a music scholar, even the most anti-commercial and anti-mass culture movement negotiated with commercialism and sought for ways to live with its principles, as well as the commercialism necessary for the success of the folk music revival. Elektra promoted Folk Song Kit as beautifully boxed in folk-friendly publications such as Sing Out magazine. We hauled out my dad's vintage Gibson guitar, followed tuning instructions, and started strumming and singing. We made progress after several listenings. As yet, though, we lack the confidence to check out the scene in Greenwich Village.
Maybe we'll go electric. I think with just what we want to do to wrap up is just show you a few of the other ones that appeared in the Designs for Success book. This was a real standout. John Hendricks, he sang in the group Hendricks, Lambert, and Ross. This is a record called Evolution of the Blues Song that he first performed in the Monterey Jazz Festival in 1960, and then he made a theatrical production of it that played in San Francisco, New York, and Europe. Just a very interesting history of really music that traces blues, jazz back to Africa. He performed it at the Monterey Festival, like it's shown on the cover, addressing a group of young children.
Yeah, with the kids on stage, I wish I had heard the record when I was that age. I would have been much better educated in music. It's an amazing, amazing production. Hear How to Improve, we've shown this, your vocabulary and speech. These Hear How records included things like Hear How to Converse in German, Hear How to Play Better Baseball, Hear How to Handle Your Boat,
Hear How to Have Sexual Harmony in Marriage. So it was an interesting series from Carlton Records. It was sold in unusual places. So bowling records were sold in bowling alleys. Hear How to Improve Your Fishing was sold in tackle shops, drugstores, supermarkets.
This one is great because you really do get the sense that if you were to be successful, you needed to have a certain kind of vocabulary and you needed to know how to pronounce certain words. So on this one, there are 150 words that are just read out with the appropriate pronunciation. Words like abyss,
Medieval,
grandeur,
maniacal,
qualm,
orgy. I can't imagine why you'd be using the word orgy in a business situation, but there it is.
and then almond, they pronounce it almond.
Almond, yes.
Almond. Anyway, this is what you need for success in terms of your vocabulary. This was a wonderful record, ethnic dances of Black people around the world. It's gatefold. It doesn't give us any information on Marie Brooks, who's the person who created it, but it comes with 2 records. And of course, we did some research on Marie Brooks.
And it was a record designed for junior high and high school curriculum, where Marie Brooks wanted to introduce, alongside square dance and waltz, what she called ethnic music dances.
And so it comes with this bound booklet. And as you go through the record, side A, side B, the different tracks, she has for this one, the Igbo dance originated among the Igbo tribes of Nigeria, West Africa. And she's tried to include little just drawings of body positions to give people the sense of how their elbows should be bent, how their knees should be bent, kind of the choreography and body position. And she does that throughout these really earnest attempts to show body alignment, and we love this one. Ready for this one?
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe the last one will show. This is Leonard Bernstein conducts for young people, New York Philharmonic, and we were interested in the cover. It says lettering, Taro Suzuki, age 9. So this came out in about 1963, and I'm thinking, he was 9 in 63. Maybe Taro Suzuki is still around. So I did a big Google search and came up with someone who taught at the visual school in New York. And sure enough, it was him. So I wrote him and I said, "Dear Mr. Suzuki, is this you? Did you do this lettering?" And he said, "Oh my God, I did. I'd completely forgotten about this record, but my parents were designers and that was my first work." So to us, it was really rewarding to find out that he's still an artist. And this was his first major work.
We like that about writing about these records, because there are so many elements to them. There's always the chance that we're going to connect with people. So in the dance book, we wrote about folk dances, a whole chapter, and one of them was Greek folk dances. And I was able to get in touch with a folk dance center for Greek dances in Chicago and communicate with those people. And they helped me with some of the translations that were done only in Greek lettering on some of the records. So I think our feeling is one of the most rewarding things about writing these books has been meeting the people who have stories to tell about their own records and their own memories, but also reaching out and communicating with family members. If say the artist is already passed, the kids may be in charge of the estate and they have memories to tell. So that's been a really great part of writing these books.
Yeah, let's open it up. Questions.
As we do.
Sorry, I'm
There you go.
now unmuted. Okay.
All right.
It's funny how that can keep happening for years. Yeah, thank you so much. That was really quite a fascinating presentation. Really thought-provoking. So we have a healthy number of questions for you. And the first one is from Giannis. Giannis, you asked a few questions. I wonder if you want to just ask the process question about their writing process. I think that's one of particular note.
Yes.
Really interested a lot of people.
First, though, I want to ask, what was the Greek folk dance center in Chicago? What was the name? Was it Orpheus?
Say it again.
What was a Greek dance center?
Orpheus.
I don't think it was. No.
Because I was a Greek folk dancer in Chicago for quite some time.
Oh my God, that's so cool. Well, there were some essays written by a guy, and again, this was the second book, and my brain is in the third book right now. But there was a guy who just wrote some really wonderful essays, and I thought I need to find out who this guy was, and that led me to the Greek folk dance group in Chicago. It might even have just been the Greek Cultural Center. And I found two people who were so helpful, and I was able to track the guy down, but I don't think he ever replied to me. But wonderful essays. Yeah, so anyway, sorry.
Okay.
Jonathan's paging through the book to see if he can find the footnote right now. So go
Okay,
ahead.
I,
Question.
I can contact you about that after the you don't sweat it over
Okay.
right now. Now my question is, because you are a couple, you are a writing couple. So I'm wondering, how do you balance the who writes, who takes the notes with the researcher, and do you do the writing jointly? Do you each pick up a chapter? How do you coordinate and how do you mesh your writing style?
I mean, I think we each probably have a couple of records to begin with that we just can't wait to write about. So I might start writing about one, and I might start with the description of the cover. Jonathan might go with his favorites initially and start doing some research and gathering footnotes. And I might wait on the footnotes, and Jonathan might wait on the description.
But I think in general, we might write sections of an introductory chapter separately, and then we do just an enormous amount of editing and proofing of each other's work. And then maybe I'll start on a couple of records, and then I'll hand it over to Janet, and Janet will redo them, and then she'll write a few, and then I'll edit them. So we end up working over every single sentence. And I think we've gotten better at not getting upset when some writing partner takes out an incredibly important clause.
An incredibly important sentence, just the right word that I had there, and I look back for it and it's gone. Like, where is that word? And then he's like, oh, I cut that.
Yeah.
Well, that used to just send me.
Yeah, we've gotten used to it.
We've
now.
gotten better, and especially because I was saying for the dance book, we were so enthusiastic about all the records. We wrote way too much, and we had to cut back. We just became a little more relentless about our ability to cut. But I think in the end, we both do everything. We really do. I think we're driven by the initial attraction to certain bits of the object, and then I might not fill in something, and Jonathan will come back and say, oh, didn't you see this was this particular musician, let's put that in. And then I'll say, oh, George Avakian, he did the notes to this, we've got to bring that in. And then I think one part that's hard too is to try to figure out what each of us writes goes into the footnote eventually, because here we are so proud of our prose that's appearing in, and they're like, you know what, that's got to be a footnote, and then we have to drop it down into a less findable space. But we sit next to each other and write a lot.
Wow, thanks. Our next question comes from Dana Pullen. Dana, do you want to unmute?
Sure. So I thought this was great, by the way, and I love the trilogy, and I think I told you that in an email. So my question is about the role of music in instructional albums that are not primarily music oriented. I mean, for example, Jonathan sang a little bit of the military album, so I'm interested in stenography albums or typing albums or whatever that might have music somewhere, maybe as an interlude, sometimes as a background. I'm thinking that maybe some of the cooking albums might have had
Definitely
the music of the culture. So could you just talk about that, the role of music in non-musical instruction?
Yeah, I'm thinking of Bonnie Pruden, so big, kind of an early exercise guru on television. And, each one of her records has music, and she had a TV show, so there was a music director. Some of it's interesting, some of it's just kind of easy listening jazz background music. But clearly it was important enough for her to include it on her records as part of a way to get people to listen to the record over and over and over. So it wasn't just her voice.
So yeah, clearly it couldn't be too irritating songs either. I mean, they had to be listenable. You had to be able to do your sit-ups to that music every single time, I suppose. That's really funny.
And there's kind of a record, Music to Help You Stop Smoking, that RCA Camden put out, and there's no text in that one. It's just music. So in some ways it's almost like a new YouTube video that has relaxing music that's supposed to get you into a different mind space that will allow you to relax and not smoke.
And then there were there's a series, of course, we could only put one in. We would have wanted the whole series in, but we had to cut it down to one record, of how to go from tense to relax. And the music starts with that tension, and it's sort of a classical-ish sound, and it starts with booming and crashing and intimidating, and then it kind of moves into
Stravinsky
something,
light, yeah.
moves into something more calming. And there's no text on that either. You have to be really guided by the liner notes in that case to understand why you'd begin on, side one and why you would end at the end of side two. In the Music for Gracious Living records, which was in Design for Hi-Fi Living, the first ones, those are the ones that had so much instruction on the back cover, whether it was how to, cook the shrimp on the Barbie, or char the steak just right, or redecorate DIY your rec room. Those are music, they're not spoken word. And so there is that sense that this is the soundtrack. Why that music? It could just have been a repackaging of music that they had already paid for at the studio, and they wanted to get it out there again, and they came up with music for redecorating your living room, and so they repackaged it. So there's not really much more to it than that. But the idea would be, you're in your new rec room, you're starting to put up your shelves, and this is a relaxing soundtrack to do that kind of work.
Great, thank you.
All right. Francesca, you're next.
Oh yeah, my question was really related. I was just interested in your sense in the music related albums of a kind of process of selection, and whether for the dancing albums or for the musical ones, if there was a sense of like an anthology or an attempt to represent a genre of music, and just what you're noticing. And also I just thought that the Robert Mitchum Mambo album just sounded really provocative, and I was just curious what it sounded like.
The Calypso, the Robert Mitchum Calypso.
Yeah, Calypso.
I mean, there are a couple of the songs that he sings that pop up occasionally. If you do like steel drum music on Pandora, his version of Jump Up or whatever will come up. You'll hear him, and he's trying to evoke this Calypso accent. He's trying to get those rhythms. It's quite terrible, but people like it, it's like,
no, and reviewers have called it a compendium. We didn't, it's not an encyclopedia like the dance records, but we tried to represent genres. A lot of them were driven by records that we already had in our collection, but then when we got serious about writing the book, we knew there was a few that we had to buy from eBay or Discogs.
I hated that.
I hated
that. I wanted it to be all about being in the record stores, digging through the bargain bins. I didn't want to pay over 75 cents for a record if I didn't have to. And that's what kind of gets collectors, because they're like, oh, super valuable records. I'm like, dude, I didn't pay 50 cents for most of these. And that makes me happy. Like, I love that. And that's why we spent so much time in Detroit or wherever we're digging through the bins. So the first book really was mostly records we already had.
By our own
we really tried to do that. But with the dance, we're like, we got to fill out rumba. It's not so easy to find rumba records in the bargain bins anymore. And of course, time's going by. So when we started writing the book proposal for Design for Hi-Fi Living, it was like 2014-15, right? I mean, when we first started. And by that, at that point, it was pretty easy to find some of these records. Nobody was looking for music for gracious living, music to barbecue by. By the time we got to about 2018, we're like, oh wow, people are plucking these records. We're gonna have to fill out some of the ones that we need for especially Calypso or whatever. We're gonna have to go on eBay, and that was sad, but it was okay.
And in the end, a lot of the decision making was what's visually interesting.
Yeah,
we had way more dance records than we could fit. We limited it to 300, and we let that drive what we were going to do, but also somewhat representative.
Yeah. And when we realized, how much we were going to have to work on each dance. Each dance had to be described, and we didn't have to be experts in it, but we had to do a really fine job in differentiating the dances and making sure the rhythms were clear. And of course, we have made some playlists that are on Spotify. So it is possible to listen and say, oh, now I understand. Because I couldn't have told the difference sometimes between a mambo and a rumba. But now I feel like I have a couple of just sort of classic riffs in my head. And now I get it. It's like, oh, it's really satisfying to be able to tell the difference, between Tito Puente and Tito Rodriguez, and be like, yeah, I can tell the difference now.
That's terrific. Thank you.
Thanks. Carl Wilson, you're next.
Yeah,
Kitty!
great. Hi. Yeah, this spawned so many thoughts, but particularly I was thinking about that era of the LP as parallel to, say, the introduction of the paperback, and this is specifically what my question is about, to YouTube, and Jonathan mentioned YouTube a little earlier, as these moments when a new medium kind of springs into being a dominant new medium and everything floods into it. Like when you talk about like the bowling instructional records and that kind of thing, that really makes me think of like the thing that we've been able to do for the past decade or so is anything you want to know about. You type into a search bar on YouTube and there's an instructional video of some kind about it. But I think that there's a specific character to these mid-century LPs also that's a little different. So I'd love to hear you talk about the similarities and differences and how media evolve through that kind of catch-all moment to a more specialized moment,
Yeah.
And that's been a big part of our project, is to try to include record albums within the mid-century or modernist or post-war project. Obviously film, television, literature, comic books all have taken their turn on that stage to say, yeah, these were important cultural elements that need to be considered as
disseminated,
as worth thinking about.
Yeah.
And that's what we've tried to do with record albums, and not just the recorded content, but the ephemera, the illustrators, the photographers, the typography, and the liner notes. And I think one of the things that again we try to do with the Design for Success is look at it through this kind of Cold War, post-war lens, where there's this incredible optimism for do-it-yourself American values, being able to change your kind of station in life through improvement.
I think it was striking, and I don't think it was obvious to me initially, that when I looked at my record album, which I loved as a black vinyl record album, that it was a dissemination system. I don't think that was immediately apparent to me, even though I've worked in consumer behavior and marketing and branding and talked about packaging and stuff in my academic career at various times. We understood that it was a marketing package. We understood that there was something that the companies were going to value if it was attractive and it gained people's attention, and that caused them to hand over money. So I knew that, but I don't think I really understood. And I think when our phrase information distribution system, information distribution format came up, I think that allowed then maybe me to understand, oh, there are different formats in different eras, and cutting edge technologies take these things out into the world. And depending on how excited the powers that be might be about disseminating certain information, that technological information distribution format will be used in different kinds of ways. And there might be information people aren't excited about getting out there. And then there's going to be information that, they want to go to every corner of every household. So I think it's interesting, yes, to just recognize that the vinyl records, beyond being beloved objects, were part of that. Were part of that system. And yet to think, as you said, that they also were more specific. They weren't just yet another distribution format, but there was something special about them in and of themselves. And people have talked about the acoustics and the warmth and the ritual of putting it on and taking it off and putting it away and storing it and cleaning it and coveting the grooves and everything. But I think there is a certain kind of expertise that comes across in some of these vinyl record album packages where, you know, you're looking and you find George Avakian talking about the Chucker nightclub and restaurant in California, and that somebody did, you know, the woodchopper's ball there, and that some people wanted to get up and dance. And so the liner notes, according to this expert who's put this kind of time and energy into learning so much about the world of music, and then think of that against, say, YouTube. And I'm not saying that expertise isn't present in some of those YouTube videos. Obviously it is. And the dude that I've never heard of who's using Oxybrite to like clean his deck is valuable to me, right? But it's not like he's got a degree. It's not like he's dedicated his life necessarily to this. So, you know, I don't really have any, you know, much more to say about it, but my sense is to think about the expertise that might have been called upon to create that unique package. And how tiresome I find some of these YouTube videos of people who really know very little, but who manage to gather followers based on the flimsiest threads. But I'm old, right? So that's how I think. So, you know.
So I have a question, which actually I think follows nicely from that, because it's sort of about what YouTube lacks, which is gatekeepers, and those gatekeepers being record labels. And I'd just like to hear you talk a little bit more about, well, one thing I was curious about is whether there were labels specifically devoted to instructional records, or did they tend to be issued by labels that also issued music? I was trying to remember. I think Folkways might have done some of these. You know, was there like a separate wing or something inside labels for these? And also, if you could just maybe talk a little bit about like if you've read like internal documents or anything, like sort of what the profit motive was, sort of, first of all, what it was, like how profitable, what were these, and like how was it this talked about as a kind of profit venture?
Yeah, there's an interesting backstory to especially like the music appreciation records. So early recording industry was strongly criticized for dumbing down music instruction. You know, that if you didn't have to practice, you could just listen to a record or play a record and not play at all. This was going to destroy culture. So the record industry kind of ramped up and said, oh, music appreciation is an important part of the cultural life. And it's also a bulwark against Europe, which, you know, obviously they're beating us in the cultural market. So American labels like Columbia and RCA began to really piggyback on this music appreciation movement, and it had radio shows, books, and lots of records. So that's kind of an early 20th century backstory. And yeah, the labels, I mean, Columbia and RCA put them out, but also there's lots of labels that are specifically focused on some aspect of instructional records. So Kimbo Records was for children and kids, but they also introduced this record.
Yeah.
Conversaphone Records did language instruction records, but they also did, you know, other records that
you know, like nursery rhymes. Some of those were
dance
like
records.
45s. So that
Golden Records.
Yeah, Golden Records. So that they would come with a little book, and then the kid would put the record on and it would be read along. And, you know, we all probably had those as kids.
And yeah, like we said, Carlton, Hear How Records, they did pretty well. But also, like Jamie Aebersold had a whole series of records, how to teach music. And then there was a company called, well, it's still in business, Music Minus One, music instruction records. So there'd be a jazz combo, but it'd be without the saxophone. So you could play along with extremely good players or drums, blue drums. So excellent recordings you could play along with the drums. And those records sold pretty well.
And they're still out there. We have friends who play in various kinds of combos, and they're like, well, don't ever quote me on this, but that's how I learned to play some of my first solos, was I was using Music Minus One, as if that were cheating, you know, somehow to use it. But I mean, I'm thinking of in the first book, we did a chapter on the Capital of the World series, and
so that was Capitol Records' kind of incursion into what now gets called world music.
And we would almost say they're implicitly instructional on how to travel the world, right? And that might push you to learn a language or whatever. They're not explicitly instructional, but they definitely are trying to get you to learn about other parts of the world, particularly our allies, or to help realign after World War II. You know, let's listen to some Italian music and start to feel more at home with Italy. And
they, you know, internal marketing documents showed that they didn't expect to sell very many titles of music of the Kasango or Zulu music. They were selling more records like German beer drinking songs.
So we went to the library in Kansas City.
University of Missouri, Kansas City has some Capitol archives.
Dave Dexter Jr., who was the producer of the Capital World series, he's the guy that didn't like the Beatles. He got known as the man who hated the Beatles. But his notes and boxes went to the archive in Kansas City. So we went there to look at the Dave Dexter Jr. notes, and we had minutes from the meetings of them talking about the Capital of the World series, and they came right out and said it. They're like, well, we think, you know, this percentage of the records that have to do with Peru and China or whatever will be shipped to those countries. Like, people in those countries who are expats, for example, might want them over there, but then other people might be, oh, you know, I'm Chinese, I continue to live in China, but here's a big record company from the US who's putting out a record of our music. I want to hear what they are saying is our music. So maybe that could have been a small market.
And the instructional records, there was a sense that these would get different kinds of customers in record stores.
Yeah.
You know, customers that might be focused on their children learning French, they'd come into a record store and buy Miles Davis.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. That's really fascinating. Joe, Mabel, you have a very interesting question here.
Yeah, you touched on this a little bit here and there, but I wondered how much you looked into the kind of records that were created with for children with a kind of mixture of entertainment and instruction. I'm thinking of Tom Glazer did several of them, including one I had as a child, We're Building a City. Bob Keeshan, better known as Kangaroo, did several, including a surprisingly good one, or at least once it hits about the 1930s, on the history of jazz. Mm-hmm. The early parts are a little embarrassing, but once he hits more or less contemporary times, it's great. I wondered how much you looked into any of those.
We do have a few of these children records. You know, Songs to Learn by, a series from Columbia, little EPs. How to Think by Steve Allen. Cannonball Adderley's Guide to Jazz for Children.
The New Math.
Wonderful record.
The one on the New Math. So really quite complex, you know, calculus, set theory.
The New Math. That's a artifact.
Is that what
so
chapter
that
is that in?
I think there was a chapter called Family Fidelity or Family Harmony.
Oh yeah. So
where we looked at these records of how to tell your children the facts of life. That was one of them, but also how they could learn to read.
So because we divided the book into what made sense to us in terms of the zones in which the self could be altered for success in the post-war Cold War era, we thought work, home, and leisure. And when in the home section, we had to have family. So we have records like things you've seen, I'm sure, like The Family All Together or Let's All Sing by the Fireside. And we try to sort of open those up and take those apart. But also some of these records like How to Think and the New Math, How to Get into College, which has experts sitting around talking about, you know, it's all for white boys. in the 1950s. And some of the schools, you know, they're not even talking about girls because girls couldn't go to those schools, especially the Ivy League schools. So it is fascinating to think of the evolution of, you know, since that time, how things might change. But my God, some of the information they were giving on this, how to get into college,
It's solid.
it's solid. It's still good,
Yeah.
you know? So yeah, so we do have quite a few records for children's instruction. Yeah. And some of them are quite different, and others are not really pandering to the child's eye in a way. They're very adult and probably not too engaging.
Yeah,
for
I mean,
kids.
so many of these records are serious, earnest,
Yeah, they are.
good experts. You know, I think obviously they look a little kitschy now, but I think they were well intended for the most part.
And that's how we felt, especially in these Here How to Tell Your Children the Facts of Life, and the other one about child sexuality. I mean, the woman who is the pediatrician who is doing these records, I mean, they could have been so improved. Of course they have all the sex gender role problems that you would expect, but wow, she's trying.
She was trying to prevent teenage pregnancy.
And she's trying to like speak to parents who maybe came from countries where masturbation was punishable, you know, corporal punishment. And she's really trying to break down some of these beliefs that are, you know, we would say probably even today are still quite damaging for young people. And so in terms of child abuse, in terms of myths about sexuality, and God love her, you know, that's how we ended up feeling. Because when we put some of these records on, we just thought, oh boy, get ready for this one. But there really weren't that many. Well, the ones we felt most about like that are Amway and the ones for salesmen.
Or Helen Gurley Brown's Sex and the Single Girl. That was
Those are a little tough to listen
lessons
to.
in love.
Yeah, but you know. Mm-hmm.
Thanks. We have a few more questions that have come in. Alex Reed.
Alex!
Hey,
Oh,
Alex.
am I supposed to act like I don't know you?
Yeah, this question you've kind of first of all, hi. You sort of obliquely swiped by this question a few times regarding both the gatekeeping thing, but when you look at these records and you think about who's putting these out and why, clearly they're all part of this larger, like whether they intend to be or not, as you're proving, really, they are part of this larger apparatus that is kind of teaching people how to be global Americans, how to function within this sort of capitalist Cold War identity. But when I think about like your discussion of the Hawaiian records, some of that is going to be marketed in ways not dissimilar to like some of the Martin Denny Exotica records, right? Or in fact, the much more dubious non-Martin Denny Exotica records, right? The ones that are just, selling the photographs, the ones that are giving the bad reputation to that graphic design that you were citing at the beginning of the talk. Or for that matter, I wonder, because you do see this with YouTube, are there people who say, well, gosh, I'm a struggling jazz pianist and I can't get an angle, I can't get a record deal, but I'm going to put out a record on how to stop smoking with no words. I have no idea about how to stop smoking, but I'm going to play you some jazz piano and maybe
It'll help.
Yeah. So like, how easily can you decipher, the good faith efforts versus
Yeah, I think with the Hawaiian records and the hula records, one of the things we tried to do, rather than just say, wow, look here's a nice set of Cheesecake records or a nice set of Exotica records, we tried to focus on the performers and tried to kind of honor these Hawaiians who sometimes are part of a multi-generational family who have been doing hula, and I think in their writing and what they say about it, they're trying to bring a cultural expression to the world, and they feel like they have a right to that. And with a belly dance too, there's a sense of contemporary belly dance is held up as a self-expression a way for women to express themselves and to reclaim some issues of the body. So we tried to frame our discussion of hula and belly dance in those kind of contemporary streams of a way to think about hula and belly dance without saying this is stuck in the past. It's an ossified representation of these particular identities.
I mean, I think, not wanting to sound too judgmental about music quality, but there is this sense that sometimes the cover is clearly compensating for just miserable musicianship, and it's just been plastered on there to get your attention. One thing we found interesting, especially with the belly dance records, was many cases it was an attempt to disseminate real virtuoso instrumentalists from, say, Middle Eastern countries, whether Syria or Lebanon, into the US market, right? So here's a guy who in his own country is known for playing the oud. Now, it's not necessarily the case that every song the dude plays is for belly dancing, but if they put it within a belly dancing genre and they put a belly dancer on the cover, then you get this amazing oud player, and the songs probably don't suffer from the fact that he's a virtuoso player. So those were interesting. That was really interesting to me.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the polka records are probably a little bit similar. Like some of these polka records are just miserable, and some of the covers are delightful, in their awfulness. But occasionally you would get someone who was an orchestra leader who had put together some of the best people in Milwaukee or the best people in Chicago. And it's really quite good. Same with some of the square dance records. It's like, wow, listen to that violin.
Oh yeah,
player.
that was an incredible discovery in the Design for Dancing book. Square dance with soul. So square dance, it's such a white genre, and we were so happy when we found this Square Dance with Soul was put up by Ash Record, now part of the Smithsonian Folkways, and it's just a stunning singer. Really, really worth checking out.
Oh my God, his voice, he's so good. Yeah.
And he was an African American activist. He appeared on Sesame Street. He had a story too.
Frederick Douglass Kirkpatrick, really a moving voice. And this was an interesting case kind of what you're saying. I mean, the cover is kind of late 60s collage. So the cover isn't doing certain kinds of work, but when you first listen to his voice, it just sounds sort of naive, and you're thinking, where did they get this person? He just sort of came in, but then you hear what he's
by the time he hits the chorus, you go,
oh my God, who is this guy? He's singing these little ditties to like do-si-do and Open the Gate, and yet the quality of his voice, I cry. I cry every time I listen to some of these songs. It's just, he's amazing. So of course we love those moments, but there are plenty where it's just, the babe on the waterfall, and it's another one of Texas Has a Hula Sister Now.
Yeah, and it makes you kind of want to know, at least it makes me kind of want to know where some of these were channeled through. When you talk about, if like something is a sub-label of Folkways, or if it's being marketed through like doctors' offices, like here's how to talk to your kids about facts of life or whatever. That's a different thing than there are still fly-by-night labels who the bottom line with minimal margins is how they operate, and they're like, oh, okay, we can make a buck if we print 1,000 of these and just get rid of them, and I could imagine that they all eventually wind up in the used bin at some record store, and then in the early 2000s. But I'd be curious as to what those distribution networks looked like in the 1950s. And I know that people have actually written about that. I can probably go look it up. But
I think there are, and it is fascinating. And I think, we have ambitions to follow certain threads and to build in certain areas of the various genres. But what we find is that each album is a universe.
Well, that was interesting.
And you kind of go the direction you go, and it might be because you found a book that has a quote in it that's so gorgeous, or you learn that the child of this person is alive and you can talk to them, and that kind of changes the direction that maybe you would go. And I hope that people will, like what you just said, will be like, oh, I want to know that. And that people will say, I want to follow up on that. I want to figure that out. Where did these Kimbo records come from? And how many were sold?
Well, and Kimbo records were sold at FAO Schwartz, the big New
Oh,
York
yeah.
kids store, toy store.
Mhm.
And they had a big record section, but they also had a catalog that they would mail, to a huge list.
Mhm.
And they especially sold a lot of language records.
And the new math. They specifically talk about having that new math series. Yeah. Thanks, Alex.
Okay, we are actually kind of exceeding the time we usually go, but I want to have one more question asked and before we shut down, and that's from Parishka.
Hi, Catherine. Yeah, I'll quickly squeeze this one in, and now everything I say is having a double entendre. But I wanted to ask about porn.
Uh-huh.
Okay, good. Yeah, specifically because anytime there's a new technology,
Yeah.
and obviously you're not focusing on the newest time of vinyl, but what can we do with this wonderful thing? And porn, like just like, oh, it'd be great for this. So I'm curious, have you come across any examples? Sorry, any examples of what
we have? Some, I mean, they call them stag records,
okay.
Off-color jokes and some sexual material, and then a lot of the comedy records. And we as collectors, we don't really focus. We don't have a lot of comedy records, but that was certainly one area where you'd get that blue material. And then these stag party records where they'd have, a pinup on the cover, and there would be lewd stories or off-color jokes.
Okay.
That was one genre, two genres that I know about that dabbled into that porn element.
But nothing that I can think of. I mean, I almost feel like music to stop smoking, or the music to take you from tense to relaxed.
Yes.
It's almost more like the sort of vibe, that you would be thinking about in something that was doing porn. But we have not come across, and maybe they're just in a different district.
There is a strong sexual undertone to like Debbie Drake, exercise records.
Yeah.
And what she's really talking about is the female listener needs to be, continue to be healthy and toned for sex.
And yeah, that's true. So both some of our exercise records and the yoga records allude to having a body that is able, even after having 7 children, remember that one, to like continue to have how did they say it? We're gonna have to look it up now. Now you're making me wonder how they
productive relations.
Yeah, productive marital relations or something
like that. Yeah.
And I think
Bonnie Pruden, we ended up including 5 Bonnie Pruden records.
Oh yeah, she talks about
in
sex.
the Design for Success
but
book.
Just very,
it's pulsing through her.
Yeah, that the men need to be able to continue whatever her wording is, to stay in good shape and blah blah blah. But really, in terms of this, it's really interesting now that you're saying this. Porn, where you would expect a building, or you would expect a telling of a tale, or
climactic moments.
Yeah, climactic moments, that aren't just musical in and of themselves, but you could just say, well, hey, here's my pinup on the cover, and here's the music without any particular words, and I'm gonna just go with that, right? Or yeah.
Right.
So
right.
But it's really interesting. I know I'll think of other examples, but I think the thing that comes closest are the female comedy.
But there was a subtext in, especially the Latin dance records, Designed for Dancing book.
Well,
and honeymoon records. And
hear how to make your husband a sultan.
yeah.
So there's a Turkish, and we have both of those, volume 1 and 2 in the dance records in the belly dance section.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow.
How to
And-
strip for your husband. We didn't include that because it wasn't so much dancing, but here how to belly dance for your husband.
Yeah, hear how to make your
We
husband
had to
a
include
sultan.
it, you know.
And that definitely, how do you dress? How do you take things off? But here's what was interesting in both those records on the cover image and in the text. You're not supposed to frighten him. And frankly, he looks bored on the cover. He's sitting in like a modern design Scandinavian chair, and he's got a drink in his hand, and he's just kind of like, he doesn't look excited about this at all. So yeah, I think it was kind of an interesting tension between, how hard do you come on if you're the belly dancer? So yeah, interesting.
Well, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Well, that was a great session. As the fact that we had to cut it off illustrates. So thank you both so much for sharing all that work with us. It was really splendid to hear about. I just want to reiterate that people should look out for the call for presentations for our next season coming up, I guess, on the academic calendar, sort of in the fall. And that also we are looking for a new person to join as one of the organizers. And if you're interested in doing that, you should contact Eric Weisbard. So thanks, everybody. And we'll see you.
Everybody, thanks for coming. Yeah.